In 1971, I had graduated from the State University of New York in Albany. And I still continue to live in Albany, New York. It was a time of Maharishis and gurus and all that kind of thing. And the week before on campus, the meditation people had come, and they were very in and hip, and they had a place you could go meditate in Vermont, which sounded quite lovely. And the next week, someone had passed out flyers, and there was a talk being given about Meher Baba by Darwin Shah. And I had definitely planned to go to the talk, and I remember going to that room on campus, but we couldn't get into the room because there was a bomb threat, and that was a time of a lot of protests going on in our country against the Vietnamese War. So it was also a time of bomb threats, and so what happened was they had to find another room, and they found a bigger room, and because of the bomb threats, the people who were handing out the flyers that evening, Jeff Wolverton, and some of you know Jeff, Yep. and Ken Rigstad, who were living to be close to Darwin at the time, in the Schenectady area, passed out more leaf flyers, and more people came. So he had a larger audience. And in contrast to the week before, here was this mild-mannered gentleman who showed a film of Baba. I remember it distinctly. Baba had a pink jacket, and he had a sadra on. And I was very taken by it. But I wasn't ready at that point in time to follow Baba. So Baba had to work particularly hard. The next year I applied to work for a government program. It's kind of like a domestic Peace Corps called Vista. And at that time, the Appalachian Mountains, poverty in the Appalachian Mountains was in. And so I applied for the Southeast, and I thought, of course, I'd be working in the Appalachian Mountains in Georgia. And so I go for the orientation in Atlanta, and I look at my packet, and it says Horry County, South Carolina. I had no idea where in the world South Carolina was, let alone Horry County, because I was from the north. And so we arrived and immediately met Baba lovers, because Horry County is the county that Myrtle Beach is in, and the Meher Center is in. And I worked in a town, the county seat, Conway, and I got to know, as a result of being as a Vista volunteer working with the poor people in the county, the first week we were there for orientation, we were invited to the home of Jane Haynes, because she did a lot of work in the community at that point in time. And I remember having tea at Jane's house, which was absolutely lovely. And I looked out the window and I said, what sort of neighbor does she have that has a whole, like these long tall wooden fence? Later to find out that this in fact was Baba's house. So I was very unhappy in Vista. It was just so different from what I was used to in the north. But one time in April, Kathy Haas, now Kathy Haas Riley, Annie Weld, who was Annie Bell, and brought myself and some other Vista workers to the center for the first time. And we met, Wendy was there. Kitty was probably in India when we got there. And I remember distinctly Wendy was dashing around, introducing, taking care of people that had come. And she introduced us to Elizabeth. And Elizabeth asked me about my story. And I told her how I had first heard from Darwin. And I had forgotten about the bomb scare, but Elizabeth remembered, because Elizabeth had heard, of course, that Darwin, and it was the only time he spoke at the college that I went to. So that was my first time on the center. I also remember meeting Cheryl Rosen, who became Cheryl Chapman. Some of you may also know Cheryl. And we left. I left South Carolina early. I was not happy there. However, when I got back, I moved to Boston. And I learned that Jane Haynes' son Charles was giving a talk at the Baba meeting there. And I thought, now that will be interesting. I would like to hear what he's going to be talking about, and I'd like to meet Charles. So I went to that talk, and it was at Harvard. At that time, Charles was a student at the Divinity School. And this was 1973 in the fall. And I went to that one talk in Cambridge, and that was it. So Baba had to work very hard and put me very close to his home in Myrtle Beach and go through different various settings. But then I was pretty hooked. In Cambridge, and I became an immediate part of the Cambridge Baba group. But
Karen, can I ask what you were studying at college or uni?
Yeah, I majored in English literature. And I minored in sociology, but I also took one comparative religions class. And Baba was known of at that time in my circles. And I remember with the silence, we had one friend who on Sundays would tape his mouth shut. So it was that time.
What did you think of Baba though, like you knew of him?
When I first heard Darwin, I was very impressed with Darwin, and I was impressed with the film. But I didn't feel that it was the right time yet. I was just open to other things. Not that I was into anything else. But it took a while to cement that relationship. In fact, when I was living in Horry County, out in the country, way out in the country, there were two caseworkers at the time, one of whom was Marshall Hay, and another was Craig Smith, who some of you may know. And they came to visit me and brought me a picture. They brought me, I think, an Awakener and a picture of Baba. And I remember being so close to the center, having all these contacts, having this Baba picture. I had a rocking chair, and I kind of lived in well, it was more of a shack, but I had a rocking chair and there was a mantle, and I remember I would sit and look at Baba's picture. So I had these experiences. Baba was bringing me closer and closer, but it wasn't until I got to Cambridge that I suddenly, and so many of the people in Cambridge really ended up spending their lives, dedicating their lives, and working at the trust office. Craig.
Cambridge is in the United States?
In Boston. It's next to Boston. It's in Massachusetts. It's where Harvard University is, and MIT. Just some other, lots of schools, lots of colleges in Boston and Cambridge, but probably Harvard is the one that you would have heard of the most. And then after living in Cambridge for a few years, I got a teaching credential at a school that many Baba lovers went to, and there were no teaching jobs in Cambridge. So I thought where to get a job, where to go teach. And there were teaching jobs in Myrtle Beach. So after leaving and saying I'll never return to this state again, I called, I must have sent a resume to Georgetown County, which is the next county from where Myrtle Beach is. And they called one day and said, oh, we'd love to have you teach. And so there I was. I went right back down. And Craig Ruff drove back down with me. He's now a trustee of the trust office. And Meredith lived there, and Peter Booth at the same time. Some of you may know Billy Baum, who just had surgery, major back surgery. Had 2 surgeries a week apart. Billy Baum, at the time I lived there, he was a professor at Cambridge, at Harvard. So that's basically in a nutshell how I came to Baba, but I also thought I would take some of the time to maybe answer some questions or talk a little bit about Darwin, who was truly my contact, Darwin and Jean, and their daughters. Do any of you have any questions about Darwin?
Excuse me, can I ask you, why were you so unhappy in Myrtle Beach?
It was very different. I was from the Northeast, which was probably more intellectual. The South, especially at that point in time, was exceedingly provincial. And I basically felt very alien in that culture, and it was a very, very distinct culture, very different. Now, probably 30 years later, it's quite different. It still has its own unique ways about it, but at that time, people that were like living in neighboring towns were considered outsiders. So, and people were very nice to me. There was never anyone that wasn't, but it was so alien to and I was young, and probably wanting to just experience more and different things. So it was very alien to my background, very different.
And I'm just curious how you two got together, and
I'll tell that.
is that the latest?
Well, we met in India.
Yeah.
We met on
Okay.
trips to India in
So you hadn't realised you were
1977.
actually living not too far away from each other or something like that?
We were living in different coasts.
Okay.
Can you remind me a bit of Darwin Shaw? I know the name and
Darwin, we were just looking in his book. Where's the book? It's a beautiful book that I recommend, As Only God Can Love. And he just turned 97. The reason he and his wife didn't move to Myrtle Beach earlier was he would take care of his mother, and she lived to be 100 and something,
Goodness me.
up in New York State. So he, in 1932, saw articles in local newspapers that Meher Baba was coming. And he felt inside that the avatar was going to come. And he told his wife, Jean, they had like a baby. And she got very excited. And they drove down from Schenectady, New York to Harmon on the Hudson, which was a couple of hours drive, very close to New York. And they got there according to the date that had been in the paper, but Baba had left early, and he had gone to California, left for California. So they missed meeting him in 1932. But at that meeting in 1932, when they found out that he had left early, they got to meet, I guess Malcolm Schloss was there, Jean Adriel, and a number of Baba's disciples at that time. And he told us this story not too long, it was a few years ago, that he had many questions for Baba. So since he didn't get to meet him, he sat down and he just poured his whole heart out, and he wrote out these questions. And he went to the post office and to mail the letter. And before he actually mailed the letter, he internally felt from Baba the answers to his questions. And I think Darwin always had that internal link. Very beautiful man, very mild-mannered, beautiful. His eyes were just pools, absolute pools of love. And Baba sent him in the 40s when Elizabeth and Norina founded the center in Myrtle Beach. Baba sent Darwin and the family to help get the center ready for his visit. And Darwin tells a story, and I saw it in your Australian newsletter. There's something in there on the table, and I'd forgotten this, that Darwin would walk and he looked for the highest point for where they would build Baba's house. And Baba confirmed when Baba came, he confirmed that he was with Darwin helping him to find the perfect spot for his house that became Baba's house on the center. And they stayed, the center was filled with swamp and mosquitoes, and he was very instrumental in the building of the center itself. And then, of course, was there with Baba's visit in 52, and then in 54 he would have been with Bill and Francis and John Ballantyne at the 3 Incredible Weeks. And then in 56, 58 at the center. And then he and his wife Jean opened their home, and they had their daughter Leatrice Shaw. You may have heard of her. She recently, Leatrice was here, she recently passed on.
Years ago, yes.
Yeah. And Renee lives in Sacramento, right. Renee lives in Sacramento, his daughter Renee, and then he has a son, and they would open their home to the young people when they started to come. And every Saturday night they would have a meeting at their it was a tiny house. It was a very sweet, very tiny house in Schenectady. And they would have these meetings. And they'd talk about meeting Baba. They'd read from the discourses, which he ended up later doing, having discourse meetings on the center. But they had these sweetest meetings in their house. And then at the end of the meetings, they would have a few minutes of silent meditation on Baba. And then afterwards, Darwin would ring his bell, and Jean would bring out apple juice and cookies or some kind of a treat, and there'd be a little social hour. But there were Baba lovers that moved to that area to be near him. And Jean, and they loved to go out with all the young people to these little diners or these little cafeterias, which a number of the Baba's close ones did, because no one had that much money in those days. And we would all go, and he would continue to tell stories. And then there's one other time I'm going to just talk about with Darwin. I don't know.
Before you go on, with the meditation, the little quiet meditation, did Darwin give you any instructions, or was it just a few minutes taken in silence?
Yeah, just in silence, remembrance of Baba.
Yeah.
And then he would ring this bell. I didn't go that often to the meetings, but I would go up to Schenectady. But does some of you know Hugh Flick?
Hugh.
Flick, Bart's brother.
Or Bart Flick?
I know Bart. I don't know if you know.
They had the family, their parents had a beautiful home outside of Albany in the countryside. Lots of sheep, and just beautiful, beautiful home. They had a country home. A couple of times, there were a few times when the parents opened up their home and they invited Darwin and Jean to come, and the whole Boston group would come. And we just got sleeping bags. We slept all over their house. They were so gracious. They just invited. I think they would say, "Oh gosh, we wish one of our sons was having a wedding instead of all this." But Darwin would come and just give little talks, and it was a wonderful, wonderful time. So I just wanted to share a little bit of the history of Darwin in upstate New York.
That was the early 70s, was it? You said a lot of young people.
And into the later 70s also. They had their meetings, and I guess until Darwin and Jean moved down to Myrtle Beach, and I honestly don't know what year that was. But Kate and I were in Myrtle Beach 2 summers ago, and we did get to see him, but he wasn't going very many places, frail, but had total recall. Absolute total recall and telling Baba's stories. Any other questions?
Karen, what about as a child? Did you have an interest in God and spirituality?
Very much so. In God, And I grew up in New York, and I've discussed this with some other New Yorkers. We would go, I was a teenager when the New York World's Fair was on. I was 13 and 14. And there was a bus in our neighborhood that you could just go on. It was very easy, and it would take you to the New York World's Fair. So a number of us were wondering, because we were kids and we wanted to experience every corner and every facet of the New York World's Fair, did we in fact see Jane? There was a pavilion at the New York World's Fair.
They did a lot of work on it, didn't they? It's quite...
So
Kitty or Elizabeth?
Jane. And then in 1967 I went to Expo in Montreal, and Kitty was there. Kitty had a booth, evidently. And that's in a wonderful book that Jane's letters, the letters that from Elizabeth and Kitty and yeah. So I always wonder if it was possible that I did see Baba's face in any of that literature in either of those fairs, particularly the New York World's Fair. That was there. But, so that's...
What about all the since these later years of your time with Baba? I mean, what have you done or felt? You've had your house open to people. Is that
We've been very fortunate to have been able to do that. And have the mandali and other guests come through.
It's a big thing. I know Claire and I try to hold meetings now and then. It's a big thing to do, but once you do make the effort, Baba does help.
Well, we have a lot of help. When Bao comes. Like hordes appear. They appear. We had someone drove down from Oregon and slept in her truck on our street and never left our kitchen. I mean, she was just working the whole time. So people always come and help, and it's a gift. I mean, I really enjoy it and look forward to it.
Yeah. And there's the quiet times with them before and after. Everyone are there, like when they're having breakfast in the morning, or those little intimate times.
And it really doesn't feel like our house when we have these special guests. When they leave, it's back to the mundane, and so it's a gift for us in a lot of ways.
Has Bao been there recently?
Yeah, he was just there.
Yeah.
He was just in our area.
How is he going nowadays?
Well, everybody was very concerned about Bao. He haven't that easy a time walking. And I think you're all aware of Danny McGuire and what's happened. And I think so much of the focus right now has really been on Danny. He was in a coma. And the last report was very positive. The last email, so hopefully. And Bao's almost finished. I mean, we were worried, how is he going to be able to manage steps and going here and there and all this travel? And it's August, he left in April. And he should be back the middle of August, so he's managed and really enriched all of us with his presence and his talks. So.
Jay?
Would you like to hear a little Bao story before I begin?
Sure.
Well, Baoji, because he's not very mobile, stayed at our house the entire time he was at our house, except the last talk was going to be at this church called the Unity Church in Walnut Creek. And we had to drive there. And he was there last year, so he really enjoyed it. He liked the minister, so he wanted to go back. It's kind of a universal type church. But because of his neck pain, his driver, Prasava, drives really slowly. The word on my driving speed has gotten out, so I was precluded this year from driving Bao, apparently, as I understand it. And so Prasava is really slow driver. And there's two ways out of our town, which is isolated. Like you'd say like a V, and she should have taken the right side of the V, but she felt that road was too bumpy, so she wanted to take the left side of the V. But the thing is that taking the left side of the V would get you 6 miles west of where the right side would, and knowing how slowly she was driving, we might not have gotten there for the talk. Anyway, she continued down the left side of the V at her very slow pace, and because she was talking, and also because Karen and I never go that way to the freeway, we missed the freeway entrance. And as a consequence, we went past it. And at the next street, I said, turn right. Karen said, go straight, and she went straight. And then we went out to go another 3/4 of a mile, and this time she listened to me, and she made a right turn. And as she made the right turn, though, what she entered onto was a supermarket entrance of Safeway. I think you used to have Safeways here in Australia. And so at the same time, we had a young girl, Ellie Drygas, who was the daughter of our then president, behind us. She was following, probably wondering what she was doing. And we entered onto the onto the Safeway parking lot, and Karen said, stop. I need some milk and eggs for tomorrow's breakfast. At this point, it was 7:26. We had to be in Walnut Creek in 4 minutes. And Baoji's sitting there with a neck collar on, and we started laughing hysterically. I said, no, don't stop. We'll get milk tomorrow. It's not important tonight. So there was some consideration of actually stopping for food. Well, in any event, Ellie Dragas must have wondered what was going on, for God's sakes. We did make it to the talk, I might say. Bao had a great time, and he was very pleased with his program. In any event, we made it back. Bao has been at our house 4 years, and he's been a pleasure. Now, so that's a recent Bao story. The last night he was at our home. On a personal note, I must say that part of my family was here in 2000. I'm not the first one from my family here. My cousin Louis, who was 8-time national judo champ of the United States, was the judo coach for the United States team for the 2000 Sydney Olympics, and he was here and in the opening ceremony and spoke highly of Sydney. Didn't mention Baba, but he spoke highly of Sydney. So we've had some representatives here, at least from my family, before this week. Now, my personal story is not the same as Karen's. It's actually much different. I know Karen's story a bit, although not all of it as she described. And when Michael said we would be giving this talk, I've been thinking about this a lot. And the nice thing about doing that is, because I've never given my talk in full about Baba before, was that it dredged up memories of my life, good and ill, and got me back to my childhood. And so for my own talk, I'm sorry if I bore you with the details of my life, but it does come to Baba. I didn't have a Darwin Shaw in that sense to do it. I was born in October of 1946. My parents, if I could bring their history quickly, my father was the eldest of 5 children of 2 Russian Jewish immigrants to the United States. They were exceedingly poor, and if they had a penny, my father said, they were wealthy. And so he was born in great poverty in New York, and but he was quite a brilliant person, and apparently was a savant on the violin, but because they had no money, they couldn't afford to support that. But he did learn the clarinet and the saxophone and played in jazz bands throughout in the swing time. And he met my mother, actually, in the mountains of New York. My mother was from Philadelphia. She was from a more middle class. My grandfather, her father, had a business, and he was somewhat successful. And so they met that way. And they got married in 1941, and he fought in the Second World War for 5 years, made it to the Philippines, where he almost passed. And then they came back and moved to Philadelphia, in with my grandparents. And my grandfather, I was the eldest grandchild and the eldest grandson, and that was important. And I was treated like kind of a king in my family. And sadly for me, and I guess the family, my grandfather died when I was about 3 and a half, and my grandmother became head of the family, and she was given great respect, and whatever she said was to be. And when I was 6 months old, we moved to a different community, the last part of Philadelphia. Philadelphia is in the state of Pennsylvania, not too far from New York, and where the Constitution of the United States was written, and the Declaration of Independence. And as a child, when my grandfather died, I talked about God a lot, apparently, from what I'm told. I was extremely mischievous and rambunctious and had a lot of energy. We actually found my mother's diaries about 1.5 years ago when my father was dying, and we read them, a great relief, and the family had a great laugh at my expense, which is fine. And as I grew up, I remember thinking of God a lot, and it was thought that I would be a rabbi or some such. We were Jewish, and my grandmother inspired me to be big in the community. But I didn't have a sense of religion, really a good sense of it. I was too rebellious. And after school, I would go to what was then called Hebrew school, which was Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, or Monday, Wednesday, and Sunday. So not only was I going to public school, but then I would have to spend 2 hours after school when I wanted to be playing ball, going to the school. And I was very fast. I could read Hebrew very quickly, and I knew the history, and I was very talkative. It's been the problem. And so I really made a pain of myself, and after what's called a bar mitzvah at the age of 13, you become a man, hard to believe. It was kind of inspired in my mother that my services might be better served elsewhere, and that my mother was very important in the community, and that it would be helpful to the school if I would go elsewhere and serve that purpose elsewhere. So I was given free rein then, and I don't think I thought of God at that time. But I was always of the belief that Messiah would come. And I remember when I was about 4, somehow crossing myself, and my mother said, "We don't do that. We're Jewish. We don't." I thought that was peculiar. It's hard to remember things from early childhood, but I do remember these things. And so throughout my teenage years, my interests were basically dancing and girls and sports. I played a lot of cards and joined a high school fraternity where we played cards all weekend. Basically, I don't think I studied in high school 6 hours. You know, honestly, I was what I would say the dumbest kid in the smart class. There was like 35 kids. I went to a high school with 5,000 kids. Yes, my mother and my mother had gone there, and my uncle and my aunt. Anybody a basketball fan here? No? Perhaps you've heard of Wilt Chamberlain? Mm-hmm. Yes. Well, I went to the same high school as him, and it was a very famous high school. And I ran cross country, and basically just got the gentleman C. I'm not sure if there was a gentleman C, but if there was, I'm sure I was the one who got it. All these girls were very smart. I knew I wasn't going to compete with them because I'd known them my whole life, and I knew how smart they were. Anyway, after graduating high school, I wanted to get out of town. It was really very difficult, I think. My children, in their whole careers collectively, gave less trouble to Karen and me as I probably gave to my parents in a week. And therefore, it was hard in those days. We weren't very wealthy. My father worked 2 jobs. It was very admirable of him. And we actually had to pay for part of our college, which you call university. I went to a state school called Penn State University, which is very famous for its football teams particularly. And in those days, if you could believe it, the state law was it was 5 boys for 2 girls as a matter of law, because girls got married and they really didn't have to get a college education. Wow. And I thought that was a remarkable concept, because getting a date was very difficult when you were a freshman. And you could imagine all the freshmen got no dates because the upperclassmen would get the girls who would come in. So this was a bit of a problem. So the first year we were in the dorms, what's called the dorms, and needless to say it was all boys. And the second year I roomed in the dorms too with one of my high school friends. But he was interesting. And as a side note, it has nothing to do with this. His father was a very famous veterinarian, and he had actually performed the first, I think, glaucoma or cataract operation on a dog ever. And his name was Howie, and Howie was pretty violent. He was going through rough times. He'd come back to the dorms and tell me to leave, otherwise he'd throw me out the window, things like that. And finally he quit and wanted to join the Special Forces, become a Green Beret, fight in Vietnam. I never saw him again. I have no idea what happened. And I got another roommate, and his name was Saul. He's also from Philadelphia. He became a vet, by the way, remarkably enough, for Vet Karma. And he had a friend named Robbie, whose father actually owned the biggest tobacco store in Philadelphia. And later, Robbie actually sold cigars to Bill Clinton, which is an interesting sidelight. He was Clinton's tobacconist. And I won't tell you what that means, but if you don't get it, you'll work on that. But in any event, I was into jazz, into rock and roll, that kind of thing, standards you'd say. And Robbie was what we called a folkie in those days, like Joan Baez and Bob Dylan, and I had no time for these people. They were very strange to me. And so the next year, the 3 of us got a house together, and Robbie was smoking marijuana, and Saul was too. And I was writing the great American novel. I have no idea what it was about, but I was feverishly writing it, and I'm sure I had some dazzling insights into it. And they kept saying, you have to smoke marijuana with us. That was pot, actually. And I kept saying, no, I can get high on my own. I don't need a drug to get high. And and they kept saying, no. And finally I broke down. So in around November 1966, when it was colder than all get out, I started smoking pot, and I thought this was fantastic. They were right. It was just much better than working on my own. And and we would get high all the time. And amazingly, not that I encourage the kids out there, my grades improved. And of course, now I was a very adventurous person. I think you got the drift. I was a somewhat rebellious person. And I began turning my friends back home on the pot as well. I was a good contact. And throughout the year, the next term and the next term, I started taking more drugs. Whatever was available, I was ready to take it. And I remember times getting so high, I would say, I see God, I see God. And that was great to have around because I had all kinds of good exclamations. Everybody used to laugh, and we all played air guitar, for those of you who remember that. And so throughout the summer of 67, of course, I was getting high with my high school friends, and I was really a benefit to everyone. And really didn't know precisely where I was going or what I was doing, but there had been an inkling when I was in high school of becoming a lawyer. I had a big mouth, and it was in the family, so to speak. Michael had wanted to be a lawyer, but he didn't do it. And so, on my 21st birthday, October 14th, 1967, how many people have seen the movie Rocky? Everyone see Rocky? Well, you recall when Rocky ran up the front steps of the Philadelphia Art Museum, and he stood up there and he bounced up and down. Well, my experience there was a little different. I took my first LSD trip there, and with my friend Steve Pincus, one of my roommates, who was one of the most brilliant people I've ever met. He won a Westinghouse scholarship, full paid to college, which was good because his father wasn't too wealthy. And he was a dual major in physics and philosophy and had one of the most subtle minds. And I hadn't seen him in many years, and I called him about 5 months ago. I looked him up on the internet and found out he's an organic farmer in Wisconsin, which dovetails in with my story, but hold that thought. And so Steve and I were tripping, and I began to take lots of LSD and all these drugs continuously. It's fair to say our people took every drug that was available that came in, and nonetheless my grades improved. That was the beautiful thing. Of course, I was a history major, and as a history major, you have a good opening, a good close, and 5 facts, and you'll get an A in the class. And so I managed to get all A's, notwithstanding. And we just thought this was fantastic. And so we came back, and I was going to graduate in June 1968 with my BA in history. And we came back after the Christmas break in early January 1968, and Steve and I were just having a delightful time. We were also dealing drugs, pot, and other such things. It was a public service. I didn't regard it as a criminal act at all. We just served each other. We served our community, and we made some money in the process. And we had lots of friends. I wasn't still a folkie, I might add, but I did enjoy. They did open me up a little bit to other. I never enjoyed Joan Baez, no matter what, even today, or Joni Mitchell. Sorry, ladies. I know it's sacrilege. I did get into Dylan at that point, but I got into the blues more and that kind of thing. And so there we were in our apartment one night, and we got a knock on the door, and there, standing in front of us, was the state police and the state narcotics police and the local police, and they were arresting us. And amazingly enough, we had a friend who was a narc, and he didn't quite express it. He seemed unusually different than us, and even apparently tripped with us, but I guess he was like not doing it. And they knew where our stash was, so to speak. And this is kind of funny. They came into my apartment. I was a very rebellious person. I was politically radical and all that, as we all were. Robbie and Steve had been in SDS, Students for a Democratic Society, which was, the radical group in the United States. I wasn't quite that. I had friends who were literally communists. And so we were playing some music, and they told me to turn the music off. I said, no. And as a matter of fact, I turned the Doors song on when the music's over, turn out the lights, and sat there on my stereo, and they had to listen to the Doors at full volume, which is a 14-minute song, while they busted us. And they took us to the Bellefonte, which is the Penn State's right in the middle of Pennsylvania, which is a large state. It's a keystone state. It looks like an oblong. And this was a county jail. And they cut my hair, which was maybe as long as her hair over there. And I had a beard. And they gave me a razor and told me to shave my beard. Steve and I's hair, our hair was cut. They just cut it for us. And I said, no, I'm not shaving my beard, and certainly not with a razor. And so we refused. We sat in jail all night. And my parents had to come up, and it was humiliating for them, and bail me out. And Steve's parents had to come up. Or maybe my parents bailed Steve out too. I'm not quite sure how it worked. Anyway, we were bailed out. It so happened I was taking a class that term, which had not yet started, but was going to start, in Oriental philosophy. And I still have the book at home. And one of the teachers had a daughter who was in high school, and we used to get stoned with her. She thought we were great. And he was Chinese American, and he taught a book, and the class was on Hinduism and Buddhism and Taoism and Confucianism, and I thought Buddhism was great. Hinduism was too confusing, too many terms. I like simple, it appealed to my perhaps intellectual nature. So I became oriented. And also, it'd be very cool now at this point, because after all, they weren't kidding around about the drug thing. And this was in '68 now, and people went to jail for this for long stretches, especially in Pennsylvania, a very conservative state. Anyway, so I was somewhat discreet, but of course, being 21, I wasn't all that discreet. Hopefully my daughter will be more discreet. And and I still maintained my friends, but showed a little caution. Anyway, I was going to graduate, and the night before graduation, I took LSD and tripped all night, and then smoked pot in the stands in the football stadium, and was stoned the entire graduation. Of course, probably the graduation was 5,000 or 7,000 kids. This was a university with 30,000 kids, which went for miles and miles.
Alan,
Yes.
what happened when you got busted by the police? Did you go to jail for that?
Yes, I just said I was placed in jail overnight.
Not only, but not for being...
I'll get to that.
Okay.
Anyway, so what happened was...
Pending court.
Yeah, no, we'll get to it. So what happened was, then I gave my parents my diploma and said, "Here, this is yours. You earned it." I was very, obnoxious, and so they drove me home, and I was home, and it was early June 1968, and I didn't know what to do. Got an apartment, and everybody crashed in this apartment. We all threw some money. It was very cheap, and I got really wasted on drugs and got very dissolute, and didn't really know what to do or where to go. And so then some of my people came in, and they were very artistic, and they were the main hippies of Penn State, and they also wanted to come to Berkeley. So I was kind of like the vanguard of it. And the other people, the younger people, I didn't know that well, they left, and then my people were there. And our job every day was to end up at what called, in those days, Provo Park, which was across from the City Hall, and the diggers would feed us rice and vegetables. So we had to have a plate and a fork. That was our total day. And we got fed twice a day, And along the way, there was a young man that kind of attached to our Penn State group. We were very creative and very interesting. His name was John Willis. And John had an apartment. He was a student at Berkeley. And so we started hanging out at his house because we had nowhere else to go. And on his wall in those days, everybody had sayings and posters and pictures, like a Mao Zedong or Che Guevara or this kind of thing or that. And there was a bunch of sayings on his wall, and I found them most interesting. And I said to him, "Who said these things?" He said, "Mayor Baba." I said, "Who is this Mayor Baba?" He said, he's like a spiritual master or guru or some such. I said, "Really? Do you have a picture of him?" He said, "No, but if you go up to Telegraph Avenue, which was the main street leading into the university, you could probably find his picture." And he told me to go to this store, this store. So I went up to this bookstore, which was called Moe's. The owner was named Moe. And there were shelves, and at the end of the shelves, I saw two pictures of Mayor, two little Baba cards. One was "I am the Ancient One," and one was the "Don't Worry, Be Happy" cards. And these were produced by Mayor Baba Information, and undoubtedly placed there by either Rick Chapman, Robert Dreyfus, or Alan Cohen, because that's what they did. That's what they did. So then I thought this was wonderful. I saw this man's face, and I liked the one where he had the long hair and the beard, I am the Ancient One, because that's kind of the way I looked. I thought, this guy's okay by me. Anyway, I began to run out of money, and Robbie and I drove across country. I had to wire my parents, and they gave me some money, and I had to go back to Bellefonte for my trial. And my father got an attorney in Bellefonte. Of course, it was all fixed and it was made into a misdemeanor. And there was a fine and everything was taken care of.
Alan, how old were you at this time?
I'm almost 23 at this time.
So were you drafted around this time?
What?
Were you caught up to do your national service around this time in America?
No, that's coming up. So what happened was, at this point, I had nowhere to go, so I went back to Penn State. And again, of course, I got caught up in the drug scene because I knew everybody and I was well known. And I was staying at this house and everybody was stoned. We were all heads. And I thought to myself, you know, if I stay here, they're going to bust and I'm going to go to jail for 10 years. So I went home over Christmas. And by the way, just after Christmas, same thing has happened to me the year before. The entire house was busted. 50 people. The entire house, not the apartment. They put spotlights in the entire house, told everybody to come out with their hands up. And every kid, of course, was busted for drugs. So I got out and saved myself probably 10 years in jail. In any event, I went back to Philadelphia and had nowhere to go. And my grandmother, God love her, said to me, I'll get you a job at Kaplan's Army Navy store. She was just trying to help me out. And again, she was the head of the family, and I'd embarrassed her and the whole family with the drug thing. And so the Kaplans were friends of the family. My grandfather had been a big person in the community. And so he gave me a job. And my job was to wait on the customers. But I would only wait on black people and hippies. So God love Mr. Kaplan. He decided, he said, you know, I love your grandmother and I've known your family for 50 years, but Alan, you're not really made for this. And he let me go. But my grandmother, resilient that she was, called another shop owner down the street, Al Rifkin, whose store was about 2 doors away from where my grandfather's store had been, and she called another chit in for me and got me a job there. And I promised her I would wait on the general public. But when I was at Kaplan's, I had met this woman named Susan, and she was a very nice person, and I found her, I used to have lunch with her, and she was not on drugs anymore. And she had a boyfriend, which ruined the whole story, at least at that time. And so, but Susan had gotten off of drugs, and her boyfriend had been busted, by the way, and he was waiting trial. And she was on what's called macrobiotics, which I had never heard of before, but it sounded fascinating because she actually looked healthy as compared to all the people I knew who weren't healthy. But I was still taking drugs, but I was fascinated, this is in January now of 1969, by how healthy Susan looked. And so I was continuing smoking pot and such. And the time rolled around, nothing was happening. I'm working at this store, learning nothing, making a few bucks, thinking, what am I going to do with my life? My hair is getting longer and longer, my beard's getting... But the owner of the store had some with long hair, and he thought I was okay. And so I was home one night in my parents' house, and I smoked some hash, and my parents were out, and this is the bedroom in which I had grown up in, because we lived there the whole time. And I turned the television on, and it was a movie, and it was Mayor Baba. And the speaker said, it was said after his auto accident that he could not walk again, but as you could see, he's walking quite briskly up and down the veranda, and it was Guru Prasad, but of course I didn't know it was Guru Prasad. And I only caught the tail end of the movie, which obviously was longer. I caught the last couple minutes, and then the film ended. And it was one of these talk shows, the Alan Douglas Show, out of Cleveland, Ohio. And it was a fellow, the speaker who was talking was Alan Cohen. And of course I knew who Alan was because he had been at Millbrook with Leary and Alpert. And of course anyone who was ahead would have known who Leary and Alpert were. And so I said, oh my God, he's straight as a doornail. How did this, he's on the suit, his hair's short, he had no facial hair. I'm going, what has happened here? And I was fascinated. Anyway, I didn't know what to do. I moved to Madison, Wisconsin to join a rock and roll band. I didn't play an instrument yet, and got drafted. I thought out of the draft in Pennsylvania, but I hadn't pushed it hard enough. My mother had got me a letter from a psychiatrist at Temple University in Philadelphia saying, and I had a marijuana dependence. I was addicted to marijuana with a psychic dependence, and she thought this would help, but I hadn't pushed it hard enough. So I had to come back to Philadelphia to get out of the draft, which is about an hour story and would make a great movie. But at the end, I will only tell you that the psychiatrist thought more of my story than I thought of it. He was fabulous, and at the end of him telling me that I was not qualified to join the armed services. I wanted to give him a standing ovation. I had spent months preparing my story, and his was even better for me than mine was. In any event, I got out of the service, and where did I go? I went back to Penn State. But the tale thickens, because up there I had nowhere to go. I stayed with a high school friend, a boyhood friend of mine, in his apartment, and down in the apartment below was another person with nowhere to go and nothing to do, named Jack Mormon. Some of you may know him.
Oh, yes.
Jack had gotten out of the Air Force because he had gotten ulcers. And so he went up to Penn State because he had nowhere to go either. And because neither of us had anything to do, we became friends. I didn't know him from Penn State. Amazingly enough, he had been high school friends with my roommates, Saul and Robbie. They went to the same high school together. Amazing. And Jack had no contact, so I was able to provide him drugs, and I turned him on to LSD. I was, again, a public community service. I was very discreet. I knew everybody. And I had to watch myself very carefully because of the drug bust. And as it turned out, they knew about me. They were watching me very carefully, but I was one step ahead of them, I guess. Anyway, I said to Jack, he said, what do you want to do? I said, well, I was in Berkeley. I said, you want to go to Berkeley? He said, sure, why not? So I said, fine. So we hitchhiked to Philadelphia. We couldn't get a driveway car there. We went to New York, got a driveway car, drove back to Penn State, picked up our friend Imran, picked up two other guys who just wanted to, why not? And we drove across, and I dropped those guys off. Jack and I went to a state called Montana to drop the car off. I bought a 1957 Mercury Turnpike Cruiser, and we drove to Berkeley. This is about a 2-hour story, but it'd be a great movie. But in any event, we drove into Berkeley. I took my last LSD trip May 31st in Yellowstone National Park. Chocolate chewables, Jack remembers it to be. And I want to say there's an Australian part of this story because I always wore my Australian digger hat. I had a uniform, you know. I had an army pea coat and cowboy boots. Always wanted to be a cowboy. And we drove into Berkeley June 15th, 1969. I never got stoned ever again. And went to live with some of my friends who had moved out there. And Jack and I got an apartment across from People's Park where the revolution was. And on Bastille Day, which is in July 1969, we tried to take down the fence. They put this fence up around this park. It was a big deal. And now we're under martial law. The city of Berkeley was under martial law. Reagan had it under martial law. And one of my friends from Penn State threw a bottle from our roof and hit an Alameda County sheriff on the head. And he was not happy. And he sprayed pepper gas directly into my apartment. And we all got pretty sick. I was taking some yoga at this point, and I thought it was Tuesday, and it really was Wednesday or whatever. And I went to this yoga class, and I realized politics was not for me. And I got real serious. So I was also into natural foods at this point. Remember, inspired by Susan. And I began to, and out of our apartment, bake granola for a natural foods cafe called the Arbor Cafe, which was owned by two Baba lovers named Ed Van Buskirk and Dennis Lessia, and had been started by Harold Jameson, Sue's husband, not at that point, and other people. And I began to work there. And my friend David Milton and I started going to Baba meetings. This was owned by Baba lovers, and in the front window of this cafe were pictures of Baba bringing the must Muhammad from the 4th to the 5th plane. And as it turned out later, Eric Nadell, Erico, would hitchhike from Stanford all the way up there to see Baba's picture, and he would sit under the picture of Muhammad. What a small irony.
Wow. Yeah.
And he would, little to know that he would spend most of his adult life taking care of Muhammad the Must, but he was so attracted to the picture. And so this is a great story, but we don't have time for it. I worked and lived there. And what I would do is I would be a cook and a bottle washer in the morning, and then David and I would have the rest of the day, and if we begged real nicely, Dennis gave us $2 to do something. We were virtual slaves, but we would have leftover rice at the end of the week, so I would feed all the Baba people. And this was the headquarters of the Baba Berkeley group. And Chapman would come in, and Cullen would come in, and Mick and Ursula Hamilton, who had met Baba, had separated. Ursula had gotten fed up with Mick, and she was actually going out with Dennis. And there was a house behind the harbor, and I was living in there. David and I were living there, and we painted the house interiorly the 7 colors of Baba's flag, which went over real big, as you can imagine. And then Mustache Ron Ormrod showed up unannounced and just started living there. So Ed was living there, and Dennis and the 3 of us, we slept on the floor. And one night I was going to feed the people, and Mick Hamilton came early. And I said to him, I had heard Jerry Paulson's tape. Jerry was the last American to meet Baba. It's an incredible story. And after the meeting, Mick walked up to me and said something about, I'm supposed to sleep some way because I'm going to be celibate. I said, who's being celibate? And he said, you are. Mick is about 5 planets in Aries, so he's very forceful. And I was shocked because I was having a pretty good time. And I thought, this is remarkable. Jerry Paulson's story is historic, and if you ever get a chance to hear it, you should. But in any event, I said to Mick, you know, I'd never heard you and Ushi, Ursula Ushi, meeting a Baba. So it was just him and me in the bedroom, which I'd converted into the dining room. And so Mick sat on one side of the room, and the room was maybe 12 by 12, and I sat with my back to Dennis Lessia's bedroom, the irony of it, because Dennis had taken his wife away. And Mick told me their story of meeting Baba, except for one small detail. He didn't tell me the exact truthful story. And so I'm sitting there listening to this long story, and in the final volume of Lord Mayor, this is what the real story is, and this is the important part, because this is what happened to me. And Baba said to Mick and Ushi, who do you take me for? And here's what happened, and then I'll tell you what happened to me. And after a few moments, Baba asked, who do you think I am? Who do you take me to be? He looked at Mick. Mick replied, you are the living Christ. Ursula was taken aback, as Mick had never confided this to her. Baba looked at her, and who do you think I am? I have no idea, she said. I don't know. Baba stated, I am God in human form. I know this because I constantly experience it. Just as you know you are a woman, you never ask yourself, am I a woman or a man? In the same way, I know through constant experience that I am God in human form. Okay, that is what actually happened. Here's what I heard. Here's what Mick said. Mick said, because he was so angry at Ushi at the time, everybody comes to Baba in their own way. And Baba said to me, who do you take me to be? Mick said, I take you as a living Christ. And Baba said to Mick, as you know that you are a man, and do not doubt it for a second, so I know that I am God in human form, because I experience it consciously at all times. This is not what happened. This is what Mick told me. And at this time, I was sitting about 10 feet away from Mick, and I had my eyes closed. And as Mick told me this story, the train of consciousness, which had always been external, stopped. And it all stopped. And for eternity, the Word of God passed through me. And it turned. And it began turning inwards. And Baba spoke the word to me that he was God in human form. And I knew that unequivocally, 100% at that time, and have not doubted it. And Mick did not know this, of course, because I had my eyes closed. And this probably in real time was a few seconds, but it was eternal. I cannot express it better than that. It was as the train of consciousness had stopped as if on a dime, spun 180 degrees and turned inward. And I was a Baba lover. And then I became aware of how powerful this was. And then Robert Dreyfus gave his talk of meeting Baba a couple of months later, and the same thing happened to me, further confirming my experience. In the meantime, because
that same
experience, a different way, but a further confirmation. Now, what I'm about to tell you, I've never discussed publicly, and I'm not sure I'm supposed to, and if I'm breaking Baba's seal with me, I pray he forgives me. But it's very important because it's a major part of my story. And Ed had gotten married, and I took his room. I actually had a bed. And there was a bathroom between Dennis's room and my room, and on the wall of the door leading to the bathroom was a picture of Baba, the big one. The brick had produced, "I am the Ancient One." And we were going to start a natural food store because there was a need for it in Berkeley, and I was one of the people. And this is the beginning of the environmental movement in the United States and in the world. And I was one of the 5 people. And it's a long story, and maybe I'll write it, and I hope to do it one day. And I didn't know what to do. And I was living at the Arbor, but couldn't stay there too much longer. This is late December, early January, because we were going to leave. Some of the people from the Arbor Cafe were going to start this business. And I was laying in bed. It was about midnight. And Baba came from the poster, more real than you all sitting here. And he came upon me, and he sat next to my bed, where he stood. But I was like that. And we had a conversation. Actually, we had a business meeting. And he told me what to do and how to do it. And I thought, this is amazing. And he spent an hour and a half with me. And I thought this was natural. And I thought Baba would come back many times in that way. And he told me not to tell anyone that this had happened. But I'm not sure if it was during the pendency of the store or ever. So if it's forever, I have violated my sacred trust, and I ask his forgiveness. But I don't think it was. But I did violate it anyway, because I did tell Jack Mormon, who did keep it discreet, I must say, because I was too much. And so the avatar came to me and had a business meeting with me. And he told me it was my duty to do this. And he would help me. And he gave me points and details. And so the store opened in May of 1970, May 5th. And the name of it was Holy Foods. We couldn't decide whether to call it Whole Foods, which is now a big corporation in America, or Holy, H-O-L. So we integrated Holy. And I had 5 partners. One left early on. One was in jail for, amazingly enough, for being the biggest pot dealer in Berkeley. I didn't know that. He would give money. I was getting cash. Amazing story. He also was the publisher of Mr. Natural comic books, like Crumb, Robert Crumb. And another one was a fellow named Joel. His father had been a communist in the 50s. And another one was named Jacob, whose father was a world-famous dermatologist in New York. Joel was also from New York. And so we opened this store, had no idea what to do. It's an amazing story how it got going. And we're utterly successful, beyond belief. And so I owned this store for 7 years, till May 1970. And in that time, it was a big store. We did many millions of dollars, and I had probably 150 employees over those years, as many as 23 at a time. And we had Baba pictures in the front window. Now, in Berkeley, the intersection where the store was the 4th largest intersection in the city, and 90,000 people passed through it every day. And I have concluded that somewhere around 10 million people saw Baba's picture because it was in the front window. And the windows were like 30 feet long. We had a whole corner of a building. And we sold hundreds of Baba books and posters and gave away 100,000 Baba cards. And had linots on the wall. And 30,000 of the God in the Pill and Highest of the High. And I never knew if it had any effect on people, but people told me that they would. One fellow told me he moved from San Francisco to the area so he could see Baba's picture. And people would come in the store, you see, and ask me what my yoga was. And I would say check writing yoga. And they would be confused because there was many masters and gurus in Berkeley. Many, many, many. And my job was to get people off drugs. And I had correspondence with Gaylord Nelson, who died recently. He was a senator from Wisconsin. He started Earth Day. And I had the honor of meeting J.I. Rodale, who started Organic Gardening and Prevention magazines, and I was his favorite son. He grew up in the same neighborhood as my father, amazingly, in New York. And that's a long story. And so and then Jacob's father had a patient in New York, and she was the food editor for Life magazine, which was a big periodical in those days. And he bragged to her, and she started writing to us, and I corresponded with her because I like to manipulate the media. I had studied Marshall McLuhan. And so she came out and stayed with us, and she didn't do it for Life, but for Look magazine, a similar magazine. And so we were the centerfold of Look magazine in December 1970, in the same issue where Khrushchev's memoirs were released to the United States, to the world. And I got calls from Der Spiegel, the German national magazine, and was able to talk on television, would lecture at the University of California at Berkeley, was on the radio and newspaper, and became very famous in that sense in my world, and produced in the natural foods world what we called the drug story, which was mostly Baba's work, and it was my task to try and get the people in Berkeley off drugs. That was our duty. That was the duty that Baba had given us all. And natural foods was an alternative, a natural alternative to drug work. And I tried to hire people, as amazing as it was, who didn't take drugs, which was impossible. Had many Baba people work for me. Jack Mormon worked for me, but I had as many as 8 Baba lovers at a time. And the years passed, and I went to India in 1973. Now, I sold no sugar. I want you to know that's terrible for an Australian to hear that. No sugar, not even brown sugar. And I was sitting across Mansari's kitchen, where we were having lunch, and I was closing my eyes and meditating, and his voice came upon me, and it said, "Buy sugar." And I saw warehouses of sugar, and this went on for half hour, an hour. And I kept saying, "But Baba, I don't sell sugar." And I kept saying, like booming voice, "Buy sugar." And I couldn't believe this. And I said, "But Baba, I don't sell sugar." And I saw warehouses of sugar in my mind. And I went back to the United States, and I did these kind of phantom trades in sugar options, which was at 5, and never did a real trade. And I went to 50. And had I bought sugar like Baba told me to, I would have been a multi-millionaire. But of course, I didn't listen. one of these minor stories that never works out.
And also your ego about not having sugar.
Yes, that's right. But in any event, we were the first large-scale natural food store in Berkeley, which was at least 5 years ahead of the rest of the country. And I became an important person in the natural food business in the United States, and they were friends of mine. These were people changing the world, really, and were basically revolutionaries in that sense. And it was wonderful. It was very exciting. But I never knew if I pleased Baba. Never knew. And so what happened was, amazingly, in June of 1976, I got unionized. The Retail Clerks Union, the people who represented Safeway stores and large chains, there was a wave of unionism over Berkeley, and I got unionized. And I went to Myrtle Beach. I had a planned vacation, if you could believe that. And I talked to Elizabeth Patterson, who was a good friend, and always was impressed that even though I had long hair, at one point my hair was down to my butt and my beard was halfway down my chest, but I was clean at that point. I mean, my hair was cut. But she was always proud of me that, notwithstanding how I looked, I was a success in business, so I never made any money at all this. And she told me not to worry about it. It would take care of itself. And I lost the union fight and came within an hour of being picketed, or struck actually. And I was despairing because I felt, how could this be pleasing to Baba? I'd been a failure. And there was a gentleman by the name of Joseph Harb. Joseph was an old Sufi, no doubt a friend of Francis's, and his wife Carrie, and we used to go over to their house for many years on Sundays. And Joseph had lived in Pune for a couple years in the early 60s, and he almost died there actually, but Baba saved his life. And Baba asked him one time, he said, "Joseph, do you want God realization or do you want to come back with me when I come back?" And Joseph said, "Baba, where could I be that you are not? I want to come back." And Baba said, "Good, then you shall come back with me." And we would go over to Joseph's house on Sunday and spend hours there. And he would talk about God nonstop. He never stopped talking. If Carrie said a word, he would interrupt her and say, "Woman, you talk too much." He was really a remarkable man. But anyway, he said I could talk to Bob at any time, and I see him all the time. And I remember after one Sufi meeting, play. Sufis have plays every February for Baba's birthday. There was 100 people around Joseph. He was beatific. He would beam. And he said, only one person loves more people than I do. And somebody yelled, "Joseph, who is it?" And he says, "Only Baba." And everybody laughed because they knew it was true. He was pure heart. He was a remarkable soul. And he would shop in my store, and I never had time for anything. I was so busy. But when Joseph came in, everybody knew that I would not be disturbed. I would give my full attention to him. And so he came in my store this day, and it would so happen it was at the end of his life. He was not well. And I was saying goodbye to him. I walked him to his car door, and he was at the window. He rolled down the window. And I said, "Joseph, all these years, I've done this for Baba, and I don't know if I've pleased him. I don't know if I've pleased him." He says, "I don't know." He said, "Alan, when I'm in your store, I see Baba everywhere. And his hand is like this. He's well happy with what you've done." I said, "Thank you, Joseph." And I kissed him, and he kissed me. He called everybody darling and dear. And then he drove away, and he went into a coma and died a couple weeks later. But I was now unionized, and so I was in despair what to do with my life, because these are major rules. And the president of the union came in, and I had never met him. He was retiring. I had dealt with the incoming president. And my office was in the loft on the second floor, and he walked in, and I had pictures of Baba on my desk. And I had a picture of Lud Dimphal. Also, Baba had been at Lud's house. I wanted to be a Sufi at one point. I was friendly with Lud, and said, "Baba's house," on the door. And Lud was smiling. And the man walked in. He said, "Are you a Sufi?" I said, "No." He said, "So why is a picture of Mayor Baba on your desk?" He said, "I thought only Sufis love Baba." And this is a man in his 60s. He had started the union in the early 40s. He said, "My son is a Sufi." And he told me his son's name. I said, "Yes, I know your son." He said, "You have a picture of Lud. He's my son's preceptor." I love Lud. I love Baba. He got my son off of drugs. He says, "If I had known you were a Baba lover, I never would have unionized you. I would have known you were an honest person. And you were sincere. And I'm so sorry." And he apologized to me. And he begged my forgiveness. Right there. And I forgave him. He said, "Now, I am leaving now. My term is ending. I'm retiring. But I will do everything in my power to make your job easy from here on in." And he begged my forgiveness, and it was very sweet. So this was a Baba contact. So I sold the business behind the employees. I was kind of upset. I wanted to go to law school. And so I sold the business in May of 1977 and went to India. And amazingly, the guy who bought the business was very charming and turned out to be a psychopathic liar. I never met anybody like this. And he destroyed the business, and he destroyed other businesses too he had bought. He was a very, very selfish person. But because of that, I went to India in 1977 and met Karen at Lower Mehrabad, and she was green at the time from the food. And remember, the old days, people got sick. So if I hadn't lost the business, I never would have met Karen. So I went to law school and became an attorney. So I guess at the end of my story, it turned out that, contrary to my family's thoughts, I didn't become a rabbi, nor did I become a big man in the community like my grandmother thought. But I did end up loving God. And when Michael told Karen and me, when he was in our area, that he would allow us to give us this talk, it gave me an opportunity, because I've never given this talk nor told these things in public, to think about these things. And I spent many nights in the middle of the night thinking about that. And it dredged up these memories of how I came to Baba, and how he came to me, and how he guided my life and did his work. And I always thought that Holy Foods was like one of his constructs, like the ghee store. that he constructed for his purposes. And then when it was done, he disassembled it. And so it was the beginning of the respect for the earth, and it moved across the country and across the world. And that was Baba's work. I know that because he told me that was his work. And I was fortunate to be just the person who would do it. And did it, I hopefully, to his pleasure. And so that's the story of my coming to Meher Baba. Since that time, Karen and I got married, had 3 wonderful children, one of whom has brought us here. And so speaking for the Talbot family and for Northern California group, Jai Baba.
Jai Baba.
I was curious about the photograph you said about Baba taking Muhammad from the 4th plane to the 5th plane.
There's a series of photos that we see where Baba's holding Muhammad. There's a series of 3 photos.
All right.
And Ed and Dennis had blown those photos up and put them, amazingly, in the window of the Arbor Cafe. So your average Berkeley person would see Muhammad the Must being moved from the 4th to the 5th plane.
Were they made into a poster?
Yeah, big posters, you
Yes,
know.
because I have one of those. I think I have a copy of.
Yeah. And Erico would hitchhike from Stanford, where he was going to school, up to Berkeley so he could sit under the poster.
I never heard that those photographs were of that point in time.
Yeah, right. Neither
I've
do I.
never heard that either.
Yeah, we didn't know it was.
What do I know? I just was
Yeah.
making rice pudding. I mean, you know, and washing dishes. This is what it was.
Yeah.
This is what it was. This is, you know, this is this. I didn't know any better.
Yeah.
So before you had the experience of Baba coming to you and saying, "I'm God," were you following him before then?
Which experience are you talking
said
about?
You were hanging out with Baba people and.
You mean that moment when Nick read the story?
Yeah.
I mean the story. Well, I was coming to Baba. I was living at the house.
It sounded like you were, but then you had that experience.
Yeah, well, I was living at the house, the Arbor house, which was, you know, and so the Baba people, Dennis and Ed owned the place, and you know, many Baba people. That was kind of the headquarters for the Baba. That's where people hung out.
So you were drawn to all of that.
Yeah, well, yeah. That's why. I mean, Baba was drawing me. I was there also for the natural foods aspect of it. You know, I had been doing granola in my oven at the other house, and then then Dennis asked me if I wouldn't mind living there. I said, sure. So they were trapping me. As I was cold, this is after Darshan, I was raw meat. My friend David and I were the rawest meat in town, you see. Jack Mormon had gone back to Philadelphia. I was the one who told him about Baba. You know, so I'm responsible for that.
When Baba said he was God, do you think he meant that he felt that God was within him, or do you think that he felt like this sense of love for everything and oneness with everything? That's why he felt it was God. Or
Say that again.
what do you think he meant when he said he felt like he was God?
When he said that to Mick?
Yeah.
Well, I read it. I mean, Baba said, I am God in human form. I know this because I constantly experience it. Just as you know you are a woman. This is being said to Ursula now. You never ask yourself, am I a woman or a man? In the same way, I know through constant experience that I am God in human form. This is what was said to her. And she has a story, which she told recently, and that's her story. But Mick had converted it because he was so angry at her, he excluded her from the experience. So I got him converting what Bob had said to Ushi being said to him.
What does he mean by God? Does he mean love, or does he mean...
What does Baba mean by God?
Yeah.
Am I the right person to ask this? Baba's God. He's the God man. He's God in human form. He is. If you read the books, you'll understand. He's the direct descent of God in human form. He's the Avatar. He's the Messiah. He's that one we've all waited for, which as a child I was told would come. Nobody ever believed, except me. I believed he would come. We've been promised this, so how to come? You know, I was easy. You know.
Well, we hope you'll all come to the Bay Area in California and tell your stories.
And
I'd like, go ahead, John, yeah, please.
is Joseph's house still there?
No, Joseph passed, as
I know, but his house?
well, his house would be somewhere, but I can't remember where it was. It was in the next town over from where I live now, actually. It's a town called Orinda. But he was a remarkable human being. Did you know Joseph and Carrie? No. They were wonderful people.
I think it's interesting how you remember all these things with, you know, the comings and goings and the drugs and the, because, you know, I went through a period like that as well, and some of it's a bit blurry.
It's blurry, but there's ways. I left out, you know, lots of, you know, I gave
There were
you.
landmarks. There were landmarks.
I've thought about this a lot. So,
Yes.
you know.
Fair
The
enough.
Harps contributed, they actually left quite a nice bequest to our Baba group. And they've really kept our Baba group going
What an irony.
financially.
What happened was I was the secretary for our group. You know, we long story, but in a nutshell, I was at our office one day, which office was about as big as the area that we're sitting in right here, and I opened the mail. I was kind of the bureaucrat for the group, and there was a bequest from Carrie Harb for like $18,000, and I didn't know what to do. No, 18,000. We invested it wisely, and then not so wisely, but at least when I was in charge, it was invested wisely, and not in sugar though. As a sidelight to that sugar story, which I like to mention, this is kind of humorous. I was very good friends with Alan Cohen, if you know who Alan is, and he wanted to go in business with me, and so he thought I had a good touch, you know, for that, and we were very good friends, and so and housemates, and so I told him about the sugar story, and he thought that was great. He said, the next time you get a hit, let me know. I'll invest. So I've been waiting and waiting and waiting. So finally in 1976 or 7 or whatever, I got the hit that silver. Now I'd already invested in silver and gold in the early 70s and made quite a bit of money. They went up. They skyrocketed. And so I said to Alan, I got the hit. Silver's the thing. I had the same thought. I had the same experience. This is the interesting thing about the ego and real experience. So Alan and I went out and we invested some money in silver fortunes, and it flopped. And he was very humorous because he said, "What happened?" I said, "Well," I said, "you know, I guess the other one was real and this one was just my ego." And he forgave me. But I remember when I told him, he went, "Oh." I said, "That's not good." I said, "Well, you have more money than I do. I was in law school at the time." So it was quite funny. But you never know. The ego's a tricky business, isn't it?
So did you end up practicing law after that? Or?
Yeah, I'm a lawyer.
Okay.
Yeah, as we
So
say.
you're still active as that?
Yes, yeah, not tonight, but generally speaking.
What I wanted to ask Karen and Alan is they've had the wonderful blessing of having Bao as staying in the home.
Well, there was one moment that was very touching. The first year Bao was with us, he said goodnight to us. You have to understand, we don't get intimate time with Bao, or very little, because he's very busy, and when he's not busy, he just goes to his room.
Right.
But he said goodnight to us one night, and there was a few people still hanging around. This is a number of years ago. And then all of a sudden, we heard a walking down the hall. He would keep our bedroom. And there was Balji in blue pajamas.
So cute.
And he was, you know, Balji's like as cute as it gets. If he was any cuter, he'd explode.
Teddy bear, isn't it?
Yeah.
They were like Dr. Denton, sweet blue pajamas. It was so cute.
I thought, you know, it just was, he was as cute as a button. And, you know, this year I would say, I've asked Balji every year whether he'll live with us, and every year he's refused. But we give him our bedroom. And this year I said, now, Balji, you could stay here, you're family, you're always welcome here, and you could make our bedroom the headquarters for the Avatar Mayor Baba Trust. And this year he didn't rebuff me with extreme prejudice. He had to look like, I said, now Balji, you get fed. All the women come and massage you. You could give talks for 5 hours. He said, 5 hours? I said, 5 hours? And his eyes flickered, and he said, because when I would tell him to stop, I would go like, give him, 10 minutes. 5. And then I would go, 5. He says, 5 minutes? I say, no, 5 hours. He go, 5 hours? So Balji seemed to be interested in the idea. So you may find the trust next year if he's around in my bedroom.
No, my understanding is he wants to come here next year.
Can I tell an Alaba story?
Yeah, tell the Alaba story.
Only Alaba.
Did Alba stay with you?
No.
No, he
Stay
stayed
with
with
Sue.
Louise.
Louise.
He actually stayed with Dick and Louise and Stephen. But he would go to everyone's house and he would check the cupboards. He looked all around people's cupboards. He loved to look in the kitchens.
And he liked ice cream.
Yeah.
So Alaba's at our house. He came, and then he had come. He liked Persians, so he had come with this fellow who was Persian and his friend, who was not a Baba lover, but he was able to speak Persian to them. So he thought this was great. Came with Meti and Meti's friend, and so he's in our house, and people are pouring in. This is 1988, I believe. And he says to me, "Alan, do you have God Speaks?" I said, "Sure." He says, "Give me God Speaks." So I run and get God Speaks for him. And he takes this fellow who's not a Baba lover and speaks no English, only Persian, just about, into the corner of our living room, and he's sitting there with them, going through God Speaks with him. And people are coming in and wondering, well, who is this person Alaba's talking to, and why is he not showing any attention? And all of a sudden, Alaba comes up to me, hands me the book, and says, "I'm leaving." I said, "Where are you going?" He says, "He's going to take me in his new car." I said, "Does he know where we are?" He says, "No." I said, "Does he know how to get back here?" He says, "No." He says, "Baba will take care of that." So he's walking out the front door with this fellow who no one's ever seen before and is not a Baba lover and doesn't know my neighborhood whatsoever.
And guests arrived.
Yeah, guests are
Mick
pouring.
Hamilton from the book. I remember he was coming in.
And Ursula was walking in, and she has this look like utter bafflement, and she says, "Where's he going?" I said, "I don't know. He's going with this fellow here." So he disappears, and the party, we have 100 people in our house and no Alaba. And everybody's like, and I'm trying to keep the balls in the air. So he leaves, and about a half hour later, God knows where they went and what they did.
He said 20 minutes, and he came back 20
All right, 20 minutes,
later.
and boom. So then we have the whole show at our house. And then the show's over, and Alaba says he wants to do the Persian arty, which I think he had made up, in the living room, because there's a Phyllis painting in our living room, beautiful painting.
Beautiful painting.
Phyllis's best painting, she said. And so we had the Persian arty in our living room by Alaba. And it was a signal moment. But you realize he never was allowed out back after that, because these stories would filter back to the mandali, and they wouldn't let him out of India after that. Because these kind of wild things he did. So that was Alaba. But we've had all the mandali and Balas have come, and Darwin and Jean have stayed with us, and Phyllis, Frederick. I had Lynn Ott out for a week and a half before I was married, when I lived in Lafayette with Cohen.
And he came again.
And we've been blessed with all these guests. Stories.
Havovi and Hoshan came. This is a story about, can we tell the story, Kate? Our children had rabbits. We had 2 rabbits, Butterscotch and Snowball. And when we have these gatherings, a lot of people come, and the children all came. And it was a hot day, and it was Butterscotch. They took Butterscotch out of her cage, and they must have, poor thing, she wasn't used to so many children playing with her, and it was hot, and she must have had a heart failure. And Havovi, we were having the arti, and suddenly we heard this scream, horrible, uncontrollable crying, uncontrollable. And it was Kate outside, and it was the bunny died, and so I have no recollection of what happened after that. I know there was a bunch of people in our living room with Havovi and Hoshang saying the arti and all the prayers. And I just went into the backyard and I'm consoling this. You must have been about 9 years old. Absolutely hysterical child, and with a dead bunny rabbit. And the next time I saw them, we never even got to say goodbye. The next time I saw them was in 2002 at Marabad. And the first thing Havovi said to me was, she mentioned about the rabbit. She remembered.
Yeah, you wouldn't forget that.
Yeah, we've had Kasum and Mokum and Diggum Bar and
Just to, not to stay
everybody.
with us, but for
Our houses were the
for
like
gatherings.
gatherings.
For gatherings.
Yeah.
So
We've been very
We've been
Spend
fortunate.
your life.
When
What a nice way to spend your
we're
life.
very yeah.
And we keep bringing more and more because I like their Baba stories. So anyone who's met Baba is always welcome at my house. Yeah. Yeah, he made a deep impression on me because I was somewhat of a poet. And Stay With God was a deeply inspiring book. Well, I see that intellectually. You're looking at numbers. And I saw a lot of in Berkeley, gurus would have massive numbers of followers. It was very interesting. I mean, I have incredible experiences. You know, the Hare Krishnas and the Munis and this and that's. And all these, everybody in Berkeley had a spiritual interest. I mean, 100% of the people had a thing going. But when Baba tells you he's who he is, remember, I had grown up with the belief that the Messiah was going to come. So if he wasn't, you see, here's the thing. Baba said, either I am God or I'm an ordinary person.
Yeah.
That was a pretty big leap.
And that's what got me onto Baba, that saying.
But the thing that really impressed me about Baba, and I'll be blunt with you, is I was reading the discourses, and I was a writer. I thought I was a writer. And the discourses, if you read them, have no disharmony. The balance of each sentence is perfect. So the sentence starts, has a middle and an ending, and there's no tension in the writing. And I said, this is impossible for an ordinary human being to write, so that there's no tension in the writing. So Baba left you with a choice, black and white. Either I'm an ordinary person or I'm God in human form. She said I was an intermediary. And that's a pretty big deal. And so when he came to me during Mick's story and spoke his word in my heart, I realized unequivocally that's who he had to be. Do I have doubts? Of course, we all have doubts. We have human mind. I'm frail. We're all frail. We're ignorant. We're shadow. We're nothing. We're dirty, stinking garbage, you know. Dirty, stinking garbage. But, I mean, what choice are we left with? What do you want us to do? Say he's a saint? He's not. He didn't say that. Is he an ordinary person? This is 6,500 pages.
He's just finished reading.
I'm finishing Lord Mayor right now.
Miracles,
Yeah.
Or miracles that he doesn't do.
Jai Baba. See, we gave away 100,000 Baba cards.
Yes,
I sold hundreds of books and posters.
yes.
30,000 of God in the Pill and Highest of the High. This was free as you walked in the store.
Well, it sounds like Wendy's doing
All
Yeah.
these things are working like yeast.
I mean, probably, as I said, 10 million people probably saw Baba's picture.
that. It's a seed. Baba plants the seed, and it's not for. It's his work,
Yeah, you
and
don't
we're
know.
the fortunate
It's so
ones.
true, yes.
Thank you for giving us this opportunity.
Thank you so
Jai
much.
Baba.
Thank you so much for allowing us. Jai Baba.